We bought the elusive Intel i7-10700K on launch day and then overnighted it. And then Patrick and I worked literally around the clock to get the review turned around in under 24 hours from the time we received the CPU through the mail. So the price we paid was $410 for the 10700K. That puts it between, expectedly, the 10600K at about 260, 280 range in theory, and the 10900K, which will be over $500. The pricing on Amazon for the nearest competition would be AMD's R9 3900X, currently $420, and it's similar elsewhere on the web. That's supposed to be the new permanent price. The 3700X might be another apt comparison if you wanted to save some money on something that competes potentially with the 10700K. That one is about $290 these days. So we're going to be looking at the 10700K, obviously, for core-to-core deltas, for thermals. We'll be looking at the frequency behavior, the expected frequency behavior, and stock specification from Intel. We're looking at 3D rendering, video rendering, compression, decompression applications, code compile, gaming, obviously, overclocking, and more. All in under 24 hours. This was done. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is what we've been using for years to manage our own Gamers Nexus store, and we've been incredibly happy with the choice. Squarespace makes e-commerce easy for those interested in starting stores, but it also has powerful tools to build all types of websites. Photo galleries for photographers, resume and portfolio sites, and small business sites are all easily done through Squarespace. Having built a lot of client websites the old way before running GN full-time, we can easily recommend Squarespace as a powerful, fast solution. Go to squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. The 10700K kind of reminds us of the 9700K, where it's sort of in a weird position in Intel's pricing structure, but the 9700K, although it felt terrible to buy because it didn't have hyperthreading enabled on an i7, at least had the advantage of having a couple extra threads, whereas the 9600K without hyperthreading, a lot of the time it was dead in the water, despite being objectively better in a lot of games than AMD's closest competitor, the 3600. The 9600K was occasionally abysmal, and it just depended on what game you were looking at. Now, games that exceed 6 active threads to the extent that it tanks frame times aren't too common. Normally, the CPU can deal with it a little bit better than that in the form of just lower performance, but not game-ruining performance. That wasn't always the case, though, and those games that did achieve ruinous levels of performance made it hard to justify the 9600K over just losing 13% of your performance for a 3600 instead. It's different now, though. The 10700K has brought hyperthreading back. It's a 9900K, except it's about $100 cheaper, and the frequencies are changed around a little bit. So that's where we are for the 107. It's a 9900K drop-in replacement for cheaper, which is how the market's supposed to work as things age. But Intel's still getting back into it after getting pretty thoroughly clobbered by AMD for the last couple of years. So let's just get straight into the numbers. We've got a lot to go through today. We need to start with some thermals, so the core-to-core deltas. If you want to learn about what cooling solution we're using, you can check our in-depth CPU testing methodology for more information on the coolers we use and why we chose them. For this, it's an X62 280mm CLC at 100% fan and pump speeds. We illustrated with both the 10900K and 10600K that Intel's approach to die sanding has had actual meaningful improvement on core-to-core deltas. At least it has so far. As we continue to build our sample size, we'll better understand how much of that is solder variance versus improvement from the 300 micron reduction in the die height and the subsequent increase in the IHS thickness. In Blender all-core workloads, the 10700K maximum core-to-core delta was approximately 6 degrees Celsius at full stock, or 134 watts. This always gets more exaggerated as the power load goes up, but we still max out at 9 degrees Celsius core-to-core. This is much better than we've seen on previous Intel CPUs for core-to-core deltas, so it appears that, following the 10600K, 900K, and 700K results we've now collected, Intel's die sanding approach has legitimately improved the thermal performance. As we've done for the previous two 10 series CPUs, we need to start next by defining the expected stock behavior of the CPU. Not doing this means that you could end up running the CPU way out of spec, which some motherboards enable by default. ASUS gets a lot of credit for following Intel guidance rather than cheating to try and beat the other motherboard makers. The 10700K has a PL1 of 125 watts, PL2 of 229, and Tau of 56. It should never exceed 5.1 gigahertz on 3 active cores, with the rest set to 48, 48, and then 47 down the stack. So our CPU, like in the previous reviews, was running at the proper Intel guidance. If you don't know what that means, check our other video on it, and also note that Intel guidance is going to be conservatively low as compared to the motherboard makers who just blast the frequencies without any regard to spec. To better understand how the CPU behaves with regard to boosting and frequency, here's a benchmark of Cinebench R20 single-threaded runs. This shows the maximum clock at a given interval. We hit 5100 MHz twice during the run, checked across all cores, with the average at 4900 to 5000 MHz for a given interval. We don't want to make this video even longer, so we won't break it out per core, but the numbers match the previous image that we showed. Before getting into the gaming charts, one more look at a frequency plot. This one shows all core frequency under a load that hits tau and then expires. The behavior is as expected. For all cores loaded, it starts closer to 4900 MHz, but immediately drops to 4700 MHz, then hits the tau expiration period and drops to about 4300 to 4375 MHz all core average. Total War 3 Kingdoms campaign will start us off for games. This one is interesting because the very top end is actually memory bound rather than GPU bound, something that we rarely see in gaming applications given the prevalence of heavy graphics loads first and foremost. We discovered this in our 10600K tuning benchmark, which you can find on the channel separately if you want to learn more. The 10700K stock CPU doesn't get too close to that 152 FPS average memory bandwidth barrier, and so its scoring has it between the 9900K stock and 9700K 5.1 GHz results. The overclock gets it to 147 FPS average, about tied with the stock 10900K. AMD's closest CPU is the 3950X stock CPU, down at 127 FPS average, which allows the 10700K a lead of about 13%. If you wanted to look at it another way, because stat math is a great way of portraying whatever scenario you want, the 3300X 4.4 GHz result at 124 FPS average is able to achieve 85% of the performance shown by the 10700K 5.1 GHz result. The R3 3300X really is enough for gaming for most users. And if all you're doing is building a gaming machine without much regard for the absolute highest frame rate performance or care for other applications, the 3300X would still be a major cost saver that allows GPU usage pretty much all the way up the stack, and you can see our bottleneck testing for that. But not everyone wants something lower end and might have value for some of these mid-range and high-end chips, and for that we've got the numbers on the screen for you. Hitman 2 has shown expressive CPU scaling in our benchmarks lately. The 10700K stock CPU is within error of the 9900K at 5.1 GHz, it's just ahead of the 10600K at 5.1, and it's just behind the 10600K with a ring overclock. The 10900K stock CPU outdoes the 10700K stock CPU by about 3.3% here, so nothing exciting. For an AMD comparison, the chart leader for AMD's section is the 3900X stock CPU at 124 FPS average. This positioning allows the 10700K stock CPU a lead of about 10%. F1 2019 gives us a relatively unconstrained look at CPU performance without regard for GPU limitations. The top of the chart is occupied by the 10600K with a heavy tune and the 10900K at 5.2 GHz, showing scaling from core and memory overclocking. The 10700K stock CPU is about equal to the 9700K stock CPU, so the extra threads don't mean a whole lot here. We saw the same behavior with the 9700K and 9900K, both at 5.1 as well. The 10900K stock CPU leads the 10700K stock by about 2.5%, so the delta is meaningless in a practical sense, and the lows are also within error. The 10700K at 5.1 scales directly, responding with a 283 FPS average from a 5% uplift against stock, which ranks it as between the 9900K at 5.1 and the 10900K at 5.2 GHz. AMD's CPUs are mostly led by the 3300X with a memory tune and Infinity Fabric tune at 242 FPS average peak, but as for comparisons using our standard test memory, the 3700X is closest in stock performance at 239 FPS average. That's about a 13% lead again for the 10700K versus the 3700X stock. At 1440p, all the results become truncated by a GPU limitation. We include these charts to show realistically what's expected for higher resolution gaming where GPU limitations are a real consideration, but the frame rate is still very high. F1 is great for that. In these results, we still see a direct advantage for the higher end Intel parts with higher frequencies, but that advantage becomes more constrained. The 10700K, for example, is now about equal with the 3700X and the 10600K stock CPUs. Overclocking still pushes it toward the top, but they're all about the same at that point. The Division 2 is another great example of a realistic GPU bind. This is at 1080p medium, and that's the limit of what we're willing to run for a benchmark. Although we could force more scaling by further driving the settings into the ground, at some point we have to draw the line for what's reasonable or useful to the end user. Sure, we could show more scaling here by dropping the resolution comically low, but ultimately, outside of speculation on what that might mean for the future, which is always a dangerous game to play, there's not a whole lot of practical information that we can derive from that. Everything between the 10700K and 9900K at 5.1 gigahertz is roughly within error, or close enough, since it's all limited by the GPU. No meaningful differences emerge until we get to AMD's parts, statistically speaking, and even those differences aren't necessarily appreciable to most users. But they'd be important for people who are frame snobs, and we don't mean that in a critical way. From the standpoint of a strict CPU review, these numbers are invalid for measurement of differences, because the 10 series would peak higher, and so you'd have a bigger gap. However, they're valid for illustrating that real limitations outside the CPU are often encountered first. Shadow of the Tomb Raider with DX12 is next. The 10700K stock CPU ran at 166 FPS average stock, with frame times paced consistently behind as compared to other CPUs on the charts, while the overclock posts no meaningful gain. Note that this is a title where we saw good scaling out of cache ratio overclocking on our 10600K and that content, so that'd be the next move to improve 10700K performance. The 10700K ends up functionally the same for performance as the 106 in gaming. It has a technical advantage, as in a measurable and repeatable one, but not an appreciable advantage. The 109 stock CPU runs about 7% better here, but also runs into a GPU limit at the top, illustrated by the tied results of the 10900K stock and the OC benchmarks. That gap is wider in some of the earlier games we showed, if you wanted to see true scaling. The 10600K is also competitive, and although this is an arms race where you could also OC the cache of the 107, the 106 can be made competitive at least with these results. As for Ryzen, that establishes its top end at about 150 FPS average in this game. So, the 3700X is led by the 10700K by about 12% stock to stock. This is the same delta that we saw in some of the earlier games, and is about the max range that you can expect to see in less constrained scenarios that don't have as much of a GPU limitation as the previous game. The 10700K also runs technically better frame time consistency with a lower deviation from the mean, albeit not in an appreciable sense. We only point this out because of the misconception about Ryzen being, quote, smoother, which isn't wholly true. Of course, from a value standpoint, the 3300X remains one of the best buys right now, but this is where the 10700K falls. Our Red Dead 2 chart with medium settings is still very limited, since we only added it after starting our initial foray into this new testing methodology. To learn why we added medium later, check out our dedicated testing methodology piece. Bearing in mind that we still need to add the 3600, the 3700X, and everything else, this chart at least shows relative scaling between Intel high-end parts and against a likely top performer for AMD, the 3300X with Attune. The result is the 10700K at 144 FPS average stock, with it lows consistent, and the 10600K about equal to it in both stock and overclocked metrics. The 10700K at 5.1 pushes up to 153 FPS average, which is about tied with the 10900K stock CPU. At this point, we're running into other limitations. We won't bother showing the high charts for DX12 or Vulkan. Everything's the same up and down the rankings due to a hard GPU bottleneck. And again, see the methodology piece for more info. Finally, before getting into the production benchmarks, for an older, more frequency-bound game to represent another class of gaming, we can defer to Steam Top 10 title GTA 5. The 10700K stock CPU slightly outperforms the 9900K stock CPU and the 10600K 5.1 GHz CPU pre-tune, while also sitting below the 109 by a few FPS average. It's not a huge gap between the top performers, but it's clear that the highest frequency parts are still winning. The 9900K and 9700K at 5.1 both curiously outperform the 107 at 5.1, and do so repeatedly. We're not sure if this is a result of some mitigation in silicon of an immature BIOS, or of yet another one of GTA 5's strange and numerous bugs, but the results are repeatable. AMD's CPUs top out around 113 FPS average, including the likes of the 3950, 3900X, and the not-so-distant 3700X. The 107 ends up holding about an 11% lead over the 3900X when both are stock. Now we can move into our production tests, and next up is Blender, a 3D modeling and animation open source solution that has exploded in popularity over the years. We use this tool in-house even to design all of our own products, including our recent GN mouse mat with all those 3D PC components on it. Rendering can be done with Eevee in real time or with renderers, and for CPUs we use Cycles. The GN Monkey Head Render is a CPU stress test that we built for reviews. The Intel i7-10700K stock CPU finishes the render in 14 minutes, outmatching the 9900K stock CPU by about 1.3 minutes, or a reduction of 8.5%. The 3700X is about equal with the 10700K in this logo render, but as we try to remind people regularly, it's important to have multiple Blender scenes to create a properly accurate depiction, since CPUs behave different ways with different renders. You'll see that in the next chart. The 3900X here obviously has a significant lead, benefited directly by more threads to render more simultaneous tiles, and finishes in 9.6 minutes for a 31% reduction versus the 10700K stock. Overclocking the 10700 to 5.1 GHz gets it between the 10-core 20-thread 10900K and 10900X stock CPUs for a 10% improvement. Here's the GN logo render, which is our heaviest workload for this one. For this, the 10700K loses rank versus the AMD R7 3700X, which now completes the render in 16.9 minutes versus 18.2 on the 10700K, a reduction of 7.1% in total time required. The 10700K stock CPU is between the 9900K stock and the OC results, which makes sense, and it's behind the 3700X. It's about 1 to 2 minutes faster than the R7 2700 at 4.1 GHz, and the 10900K stock and 3900X stock CPUs both have a significant lead, ranked at 37% reduced time for the 3900X and about 15% reduced time for the 10900K stock CPUs. Overclocking the 107 to 5.1 GHz helps reach rough equivalence with the 109. But that's about the best we can do with normal cooling. Here's our set of Adobe Premiere results, starting with our 1080p 60 render. For this test, the 10700K stock CPU completes the render in the same time as the 3700X and 9900K stock CPUs. The 3900X and 10900K both complete the render 10.5% faster than the 107. There is meaningful uplift against the 3600, but the price difference means a completely different category of CPU. The 4K render is far more abusive, with the 10700K finishing in 11 minutes stock or 10.5 overclocked. The 10700K stock is roughly the same as the 3700X here, with the 3700X being technically superior. The 3900X has a significant lead at 8.9 minutes. Now we can look at our 7-zip compression and decompression tests, which position the 10700K stock CPU about equal to the 9900K at 5.1 GHz. That's a good improvement generationally for Intel, but only because it's the same architecture and sort of the same generation with a numerical iteration. That's an improvement though of about 3.5%. The 3700X is roughly the same distance ahead and sits between the stock and overclocked 10700K numbers, although the difference between all of these isn't too meaningful unless you're doing compression and decompression all day long constantly. This application scales directly with cores, but does run into memory limitations with top-end Threadripper parts, and it also benefits from increased core count, clearly. The 10900K stock CPU is an example of further scaling. For decompression, the Intel i7 10700K stock CPU scores 86,000 MIPS, which isn't too impressive when considering the proximity of both the stock and overclocked R5 3600 CPU results. That's at 73K MIPS and 75.5K MIPS respectively. The 107 is functionally equivalent to the 9900K stock CPU here, with the 2700 at 4.1 GHz, or another 8-core 16-thread part, for about a 1% lead. These are mostly within or very near error, but worst case scenario is that they're functionally equal. Given the price advantage of the 2700, at least back when it was readily available, that's a good look for AMD. The 10700K OC does help it. It gets to 93,000 MIPS, and it brings it nearing equivalence with its 10900K stock CPU, while the 3700X outperforms the 10700K OC for the stock 3700X versus 107 OC by 7.3%. The 3900X is in the next echelon of performance at an impressive 145,000 MIPS, or a lead of 68% when looking at these stock numbers for the 3900X versus the 10700K. Our code compile with Chromium, ClaneCL, and Ninja is next, as tested on a Windows platform. This is measured in minutes to complete, similar to Blender, and is representative of a recompile of an entire project. Lower is better here. The 10700K stock CPU completes the compile in 100 minutes, allowing the 3700X a lead of 8% and the 3900X a lead of 35%, where lead here means less time required to render, all stock-to-stock numbers. The 10700K roughly matches the 10900X, not to be confused with the 10900K, where the former is overclocked to 5.1 GHz and the latter is the stock 10900X. As for the 10900K, that's leading stock to stock against the 10700K by about 18%. Our next one is Handbrake transcoding to H.265. The 10700K stock CPU finishes the work in 14.6 minutes, with an overclock improving to 13.5 minutes. That's flanking the 9700K at 5.1 GHz on either side. The R7 3700X, meanwhile, is outmatched by the 10700K here, allowing the 10700K a stock-to-stock lead of 5.2%. Meanwhile, the 3900X leads the 10700K with both stock by 12%. For Chaos Group's V-Ray, another 3D modeling application with a baked-in renderer, the 10700K aligned mostly between the 3700X and 9900K stock CPUs. The delta between the 10700K and 9900K stock results is basically within error. The 10700K OC also doesn't really gain us much. It's about 6.3% here, and it ends up within error of the 9900K at the same frequency. The 10900K benefits from a 21% uplift stock to stock, thanks largely to its core count, while the 3900X stock result is 42% ahead of the stock 10700K. These are similar results to what we saw for scaling in Blender. Finally, for power consumption, we'll start with the EPS 12-volt cable draw for a Blender all-core workload. This one has the 10700K at 134 watts, with the 10900K at about the same power consumption. Keep in mind that we do our testing within the Intel PL1, PL2, and TAO guidance for official spec, so these are the proper stock numbers. The 10700K pulled about 268 watts with our overclock applied. The overclock consumes less power than the 10900K despite a higher voltage as a result of its lower core count. For a Cinebench R20 NT before TAO expiry, the 10700K draws about 161 watts, whereas the 10900K was closer to 200 watts. Overall then, like the other Intel CPUs in an objective sense from purely numbers, this is a good CPU, meaning that we're not seeing anything that's objectively bad, at least when it's run under stock settings. Comparatively, it's a bit tougher because comparatively now you're looking at price and competition. And in that standpoint, which is the one that really matters for a consumer, we think that Intel was right to send out the i5 10600K instead of the 10700K. When we first saw the specs that Intel posted with its slides, when the 10th gen was announced, our thinking was that the 10700K might actually be the most exciting, just because of the numbers on the spec sheet. But in reality, the 10600K is so damn close to the 107 in both realistic gaming scenarios and in scenarios where we've intentionally removed the restraints on the GPU to push it all to the CPU. It's just the 106 is too close to really justify the 107 for a gaming-only scenario. And once you look at production, AMD's too competitive there, especially with the 3900X now roughly the same price, and the 3700X a bit cheaper for mostly equivalent performance in a lot of the applications. So where this leads us is we think if you're someone who needs fairly high FPS, but not the highest FPS, the 10600K makes a lot of sense. It saves a lot of money, it performs roughly the same as the 10700K, and if you're willing to do this, and please be willing to do it because it's a K-SKU part and you're buying a Z490 motherboard, if you're willing to do it, please spend about an hour trying an overclock on it, a simple one. Set the cache ratio especially to something like maybe 48x, and then try to get the core to 5.0 all-core at least, maybe 5.1. You can see our previous video on the 106 tuning for more on that, because once you do those things, it becomes a 10900K in performance in most gaming scenarios. So the 106 is extremely compelling in that regard. If you're someone who needs more balance, you care a lot about production applications, you care at least a little bit about things like video editing, Adobe Premiere performance, and you want to save some money, the 3600 is still the absolute best all-around performer at the price. Nothing comes close to it in terms of price to all-around performance. It is a well-rounded CPU. We still keep the 3600 in the top regard of, it's basically, the 36 is how we view what Sandy Bridge used to be. We think the 3600 is sort of the new Sandy Bridge. It's going to hold on a long time. So those are your two choices there. If you want absolute highest frame rate and you're an FPS snob and you play competitive games only, well, shell out for a 10900K, maybe overclock it a bit, because it can outdo the 10600 in a like-for-like scenario. The 10700 then has really nowhere left to stand, because we've now recommended a 3900X or a 3700X for people who are a little bit more production or workstation focused, and we've recommended the Intel parts for people who are less price conscious but very gaming focused. and then the 3600 for everyone in between, where you're price conscious and you want a bit of everything. Where does the 10700K fall in this scenario? It's kind of like the 3700X was, in our opinion. We know it was a popular CPU, but our opinion on the 3700X part was that you should buy a 3900X or a 3600. And the part in between, the extra $100, in most scenarios, but not all, didn't make a lot of sense. Now, obviously there are scenarios where it made sense, and we explained those in the 3700X review. But the 10700 falls in basically the same position as far as we're concerned, and either of the other two on either side make a lot more sense. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support these types of efforts, especially when we shell out the amount of money we did for this CPU for a review, or go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. And on the store, of course, you can back order our new mouse mats if you want a functional product from us, or the mod mats for another functional product. We'll see you all next time.